All right. I want to talk for a moment about Geoffrey Chaucer. And Chaucer is our first really great poet in English. And one of the things that's super interesting about Chaucer is that he's not afraid to tackle things even when they are sacred, and that includes the myths. Now, we're not exactly sure when the Sir Gawain story was written down, probably somewhere around 1000 AD, although it's probably older than that. But Chaucer wrote his poem at about 1300 AD. Now, Chaucer's point here was to write this epic story where he had a group of pilgrims on their way on a pilgrimage to Canterbury to see the Holy Relic there. And on their way, they would entertain themselves by telling stories. And it would be a vehicle to essentially have a large collection of wonderful and delightful stories. Chaucer discovers something that, for some reason, most authors hadn't discovered up to this point, and that is that educated knights speak differently than less educated millers, and that priests and friars speak differently than wealthy ladies. Well, these stories are joyous in some ways, as sometimes are even crude. But they're definitely meant to be Chaucer poking fun at myths. There's a wonderful story called The Knight's Tale, where he actually tells a very serious knight's tale, very much like Sir Gawain. And it shows that Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, is capable of writing that kind of a story. But he has one of the pilgrims, a woman, we don't know her name, she's just the wife of Bath. She's a wife from Bath, and she is incredibly wealthy. Well, how did she get so wealthy? Well, she got wealthy in one way that a woman can get wealthy, and that is she married up. She married a wealthy man who conveniently died. So then and one of the things about this time period is the only way for a woman to actually have wealth is if she is a widow. So she gets the money. She married someone wealthier. He conveniently died. And then she married up again. She does this 5 times, and that last husband is dead too. So she's 5 times a widow, and is incredibly wealthy, has managed to accumulate the wealth of 5 wealthy men, each one wealthier than the last. So she's kind of an interesting person. We don't know how to take her. She's crude. The description Chaucer gives of her is hilarious, as this kind of obese woman with a big gap between her teeth, and she can talk, rough, like uneducated folk, despite the fact that she is very wealthy. And she tells a story that is clearly meant to be Chaucer's attempt at spoofing the whole concept of chivalry. Because coming into the Renaissance period, coming out of the medieval period, what some people, I think, erroneously call the Dark Ages, as feudalism begins to crumble, the idea of chivalry begins to crumble, and you have a poet like Geoffrey Chaucer who begins to critique chivalry. Most importantly, to critique the goodness of the knights and the landowners. That, you know what, these people that we have in charge of us, that we took to be divinely appointed by God to be good men, are not particularly good. So he's going to tell the story of a knight who is the opposite of Sir Gawain, who is not a good guy. As a matter of fact, the first time he sees a woman alone, rather than tending to her needs, making sure she's okay, the chivalry sort of thing, he rapes her. But this is found out, and so he's condemned to death because rape is a serious crime. And the king is ready to have him put to death when the queen says, no, 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 let me have his punishment. And she, you kind of imagine everyone kind of laughing, oh, what does the queen have planned? And she says, I'm going to give you a chance of a grace. I'm going to give you a year and a day to go out and find the answer to this question. What do women want? What do they really want? If you could come back and tell us the answer to that, and all of us women will agree that you have the right answer, then we won't kill you. So thus begins the quest of this very broken, very shamed knight. I'm not going to tell you what happens because I think it's worth reading. Now, attached below is a PDF. That would be my preferred way for you to enjoy it, because you'll get Chaucer's playful use of language. You're going to get just the really enjoyment of coming into more modern types of poetry, and something that's in English, although this is very modernized. But I've also given you a cartoon, an animated version of the story. And I'm going to warn you, it is not rated G. It's not even rated PG. Maybe PG-13, but definitely not something that I would show your kids, although it's actually quite old. But it does capture the poem well. Then I have a question for you at the end of this, and because I would like to know what you think about Chaucer's spoof on chivalry, Sir Gawain, Arthur in general. And because now we're beginning to come into the more modern era, and yes, 1300 to 1400 AD is coming into what we think of as the modern era. I want you to ask yourself, is this kind of where we are today, where we still make spoofs and mock our myths? And is that a good thing, that we don't take them maybe as seriously? Maybe it's healthy for us not to look at our myths perhaps the same way the Greeks, the Romans did, or even medieval Europe did, to look at it lightly. Or is there a danger in that if we begin to spoof and make fun of our myths, which are so attached to our culture, does the culture itself begin to dissolve? I would argue that there is very possible that does happen. There is a point where your myths dissolve, and then the culture dissolves. But it never just dissolves into nothing. It actually evolves into something else, not always something better. So anyway, I'm looking forward to your reaction to this, and I look forward to the answers you have, and especially the discussions that will be attached to this, because this is going to be very, very important. I'm going to be following along and enjoying the conversation and joining in on the conversation.